this myth that the cartels can operate in the U.S. exactly the same way as they can in Mexico. They can't. Right? The U.S., for all that we might be concerned, is not as corrupt. There's not the same mechanisms for cartels to penetrate law enforcement and state in the U.S. as they have in Mexico. That's not going to happen. But what industries do they understand outside drug trafficking? They understand cattle very, very well. They understand agriculture very, very well. They understand import and export very, very well. So those are the industries in which you would expect to see them set up permanent shell companies, permanent front companies.
The opinions of the guests and host are their own and do not represent the opinions of Ironclad, the Border Patrol, or the Department of Homeland Security.
Welcome to Borderland, Narcosis, an Ironclad original, presented by First Form. Don't forget to pick up some of your First Form supplements at firstform.com/Borderland. One of my favorite things to do before and after I do these shows is a protein bar. They're easy. They taste great. You guys go check them out. Our next guest is Chris Dalby. You guys know who he is, an incredible journalist from the founder of the World of Crime. He is coming to us today to talk to us a little bit more about TDA and other things such as Trump's tariffs. I think you'll enjoy it. Chris, thank you so much for joining us again. Obviously, this is a little different. This is Narcosis. We focus a lot more on the cartel, the drugs, the gangs. And so I thought it'd be fitting to have you back and so we can talk about some things.
Hey, I appreciate that. And you're talking about my favorite subject, so let's go.
Well, here's the first thing. The media is talking a lot about Trump's tariffs. And you wrote an article that says Shadow Economics, how President Trump's tariffs empower organized crime. I thought the idea was fascinating, and I'd love to kind of dig into that. If you can help the audience better understand why you believe that his tariffs is going to potentially help organized crime.
Of course. You know, it's a cliche, but it's an accurate one to compare organized crime to legitimate corporations. Because even though they operate outside the realm of legality, they are affected by the same things, the law of supply and demand. How easy is it to move a product? How do you price it? How do you get it to market? It is exactly the same concerns. Now, tariffs affect legitimate businesses, as we well know, even though the fallout of President Trump's tariff plans are not fully clear at this time. President Trump can raise tariffs on China, lower them on Canada, based on the interactions that he gets with those nations. He can't do that with a cartel, who I promise you are already calculating and already operating on what opportunities do these tariffs open up. And that's not just at the Mexico-U.S. border. It's a knock-on effect from Canada, from China, from Europe. What opportunities are being created? What goods are going to be more difficult for illicit business to supply? And what new smuggling opportunities are going to arise? For example, there's a massive trade war with China. The tariffs against China are probably the highest of any that the government has lobbied. Against Mexico, they're up and down. That is going to naturally create more legitimate commerce opportunities between China and Mexico. If tariffs between Mexico and the US are lower, goods from China are going to come into Mexico, get moved as being a Mexican product, and then moved into the US. It's not difficult to see that being replicated for the fentanyl industry, for example, right? We know for a fact that since 2019, when China cracked down on fentanyl, more and more of the production was happening in Mexico, right? They moved to selling precursors and then pre-precursors. What we're going to see is another shift. What we're going to see is another shift where different parts of the fentanyl supply chain might move from China to Mexico to avoid those tariffs. Similarly, at the border now with Mexico and the US, you're going to have a lot more attention being placed on cargo inspection, a lot more attention being placed on trucks moving goods. Okay, that causes a problem for the cartels because trucks are an easy way to smuggle things into the US. They will absolutely shift to passenger vehicles. They will absolutely shift to moving through Canada, which they already are to a certain extent, and what you're already seeing a little bit, moving to asking illegal migrants to, force them to move drugs across the border as well. Then if the tariffs stay in place for any length of time, what I expect you'll begin to find is a rise in drug mules at airports, drug mules at ports, right? Smaller quantities, but spread out across a larger moving population.
Yeah, that's interesting to think. So essentially what you're saying is like if they're making it difficult to pass one way, they're just going to start finding alternate routes. I think that might be happening now, because of there's such a blockage currently right now on the border where the number of people who are coming across, which then I would say that means that drugs would be lower as well. But I haven't seen any repercussions yet, or I haven't seen any kind of, signs of stress from the cartels. So then that makes me believe that they're already using alternative ways of getting drugs in the country that we haven't necessarily slowed them down yet.
Of course. There's always a shock effect, right? If you look at COVID, when all trade stopped during the early days of COVID, there was an impact on the cartels, a negative impact for them, right? Where they were not able to move fentanyl, they were not able to move cocaine, even within cities, right? Local drug sales were impacted. Within about 3 to 4 months of the lockdown starting, you do begin to see an adaptation. At the local level, they would begin using delivery guys. They would begin using ambulances on a larger scale because those were the vehicles that could still move. So it might not be fully apparent yet how the cartels are going to adapt to the tariffs. Also, how long those tariffs are going to be in place. COVID will obviously a significant window of opportunity or challenge. What I think you're really going to see is illicit goods being moved into legal trade, for example, right? Where whatever goods are exempt from tariffs, I'm not going to go into it because that varies widely from country to country. Those goods are going to be your ideal channel to get to smuggle drugs in or to smuggle other types of goods in because they're the ones that are least going to be inspected, right? They're going to be on the registry as the ones that are not going to be inspected. Another thing is going to be trade-based money laundering. For example, money laundering now intersects quite significantly with the legal space, where you'll see front companies, shell companies misinvoicing things to help cartels launder money. That's going to go up through the roof, right? There's an incentive now for legal companies to open front companies or misinvoice things or mislabel things to dodge tariffs. Imagine the opportunities that cartel money launderers will see in that.
Yeah, there's been already talks of other businesses being started or China starting businesses in America to avoid it and all these different things that people are starting to do to try and avoid tariffs. And so I imagine in that same conversation, the cartel's not against doing the same if need be. Fascinating. I think it's interesting. Did you see us talk about in one of our interviews about the ranch in Kentucky that had connections to a CJ&G money laundering scheme?
I am afraid I didn't see your interview on that. I've read about that, not in tremendous depth. I know you interviewed John Griggs about it. I admit that's not something I've studied a ton, but I certainly saw the issue. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because there's multiple layers of corruption that's probably happening. But the fascinating thing to me is that the CJ&G is involved in some kind of corruption deep in America in this small kind of country town of Kentucky. In your experience with the CJ&G, is this common? And could we expect to find more corruption in different things like all over the United States, but in cattle, in I'm sure produce and other things like that?
I mean, think about what industries the cartel understands, right? One of the things I talked about in the CJ&G book last year, and we went on about that in my last interview with you, was this myth that the cartels can operate in the U.S. exactly the same way as they can in Mexico. They can't, right? The U.S., for all that we might be concerned, is not as corrupt. There's not the same mechanisms for cartels to penetrate law enforcement and state in the U.S. as they have in Mexico. That's not going to happen. But what industries do they understand? Outside drug trafficking, they understand cattle very, very well. They understand agriculture very, very well. They understand import and export very, very well. So those are the industries in which you would expect to see them set up permanent shell companies, permanent front companies. We know of similar money laundering happening in Montana. Obviously in Chicago and Florida to a very wide degree. Similarly in Charlotte, North Carolina, there's a CJ&G lieutenant called El Jardinero. He's one of the top guys next to El Mencho in the CJ&G. He was for a time in Charlotte. In fact, he was incarcerated there for a while. And we know, not to the full extent, but we know he still has a lot of active money laundering and drug trafficking contacts in North Carolina. So it's also on a one-to-one level, right? You've got cartel money men who are in the US permanently, and they have different roles. Some of them might be based in big hubs, like, for example, for the Sinaloa cartel, the Flores brothers back in the day were, as you know them very well, were perhaps the biggest money movers for the Sinaloa cartel in the US. You have similar guys like that in big cities for the CJNG. But then you have others who think, okay, we don't need to move money across borders. There's plenty of cash-heavy, cash-rich industries in the US where we can move money, and cattle is obviously going to fit the bill.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting. When he first came to me on X, he messaged me. I was like, I've never heard of this. And I read the article, and that's where I was like, this is going to be a really interesting interview. And since then, I've had several other people reach out to me. Crude Oil is another one that's starting to be. It probably was, but I'm starting to get notified about crude oil being used as well. Is that something that's been common for the CJNG as well?
I mean, 5 days ago, the Treasury Department sanctioned a major oil theft ring that was moving smuggled oil from Mexico to the US. The guy was called alias El Primito. The CJNG, I mean, oil smuggling was their prime economy back in the day.
Really?
When El Mencho splits completely from the Sinaloa cartel in 2012, 2013, one of the first things he thinks is, okay, how do we make money in Mexico? And that was controlling fuel theft. It's one of the main drivers of violence in central and southern Mexico to this day. I think the estimate is between 25 to 35%, and I think that number's soft, of petrol stations, of fuel stations in Mexico are entirely fueled by stolen oil, by stolen gasoline. So the fact that they're now moving it into the US, it's not a new thing. The fact that the Treasury Department is cracking down on them shows that the US is finally realizing how much of a threat that is. And again, that's another cash-rich industry. The US is desperate for gasoline, and anyone who can buy it is definitely going to pay you in cash and is going to be a regular customer. And then, how do you trace what's legitimate, what's illegitimate gasoline, right?
That's exactly. I have a gentleman who's been contacting me about, starting to investigate somebody in this whole realm of the crude oil. And I'm like, man, this is crazy. And, there's TV shows being made on it, and it all kind of touches a little bit on truth, a little bit on fiction. And it's just kind of like, what a crazy time we're living in with all this little truths in television that you eventually see come to life. And just like you said, about 5 days ago with that. And so, yeah, oil's an interesting one. Oil's a very interesting one. How much, now that they're cracking down, that someone cracked down on that, how much do you believe this is because of the Trump administration being involved in trying to slow down this smuggling, cartel, and everything else? And I'm very curious to be like, do you think because of the, haven't got to ask you this yet, so that's why I think it's important. With Trump being in office, does that help or hurt, the smuggling world? Or is there, just besides the tariffs, I'm more talking the relationship between the United States and Mexico, President Sheinbaum, and the cartels kind of movement?
It's very difficult to say. I certainly think his approach this time is less effective than in his first term. I think it's much more even for Trump, it's much more gung-ho, it's much more in your face, and it is related to the tariffs. I've spoken to a lot of people in Mexico who say that the tariffs, the threat to send U.S. military into Mexico, has reduced the desire of the Mexican government to share any sort of information, to collaborate with the U.S. Now, I'm sure that when you broadcast this, many of your listeners will laugh out loud at the mere notion of Mexico collaborating with the U.S., given how much in the pocket of the cartels much of the Mexican state is. But there always was some. There always was some collaboration. And yes, Mexico did extradite those 29 cartel kingpins a few months ago as a gesture of goodwill. And that's important. So that's the sort of thing that Trump can get done. Those sort of moments, those very social media wins, which, and I'm not undermining the importance of those extraditions. That was Rafael Caro Quintero. That was the Zeta leaders. Very, very important guys. The brother of El Mencho was part of that group. But in terms of the nitty-gritty, the day-to-day intelligence sharing, where you slowly follow the money, you slowly track down those guys, that I haven't got a sense is progressing very well.
What's going on, y'all? I'm not sure if you know this, but Borderland Narcosis is sponsored by First Form. First Form is a wellness supplement company. And, I've been with them for about 7 years. And I've been with them for that long because I truly believe in not just the product, but the people who own the company. They are a culture that just believes in your health. And so if you guys haven't tried it before, I would recommend you go and check out the Formula One Cinnamon Toast Crunch. Add a little bit of a ignition to that, and you'll have exactly what you need for your post-workout drink. This is something I've used for a very long time. When I'm in the best shape of my life, it's always been because I have a nice regimen of the First Form products. So if you guys are interested, go check them out at firstform.com/Borderland. Okay, use our link. It is the number one stphorm.com/Borderland. And if you order over $75, you get free shipping. And if you're new to the site, you get a free app for 30 days. So go check it out. Again, thank you so much for all the support. See you soon. It's interesting because you mentioned those people, the 25 or whatever it was that was extradited, but those were individuals who already were no longer really a threat. Those individuals were already kind of, apprehended. Those were, and so I thought it was almost a gesture of like good faith, but almost an empty promise. Like, here you go. You can have these guys, right? There's so many other important names we need to go after. There's so much more that they could be doing. So I almost felt like it was just kind of like, we'll play nice. Here you go. But also not like, we're not going to really start breaking down these cartels right now, because that would cause issues within the infrastructure, whoever's paid and corrupt.
I think it's Trump is so dominant in that analysis that we do have to look at what's going on inside his government. I'm certainly not a fan of everything that the Trump administration is doing, and I think the tariffs are probably a mistake in terms of what we can do for organized crime, even though I understand the logic and the impetus behind them. I think that his style is alienating even potential partners in Latin America. I think tarring every country in Latin America with the same brush is dangerous, right? We know that there are countries that have progressed. Colombia, Chile have progressed a lot. Mexico, not so much. And the relationship with El Salvador triggers an interesting blueprint, because is that what countries need to do to be in Trump's good books, right? Do they have to just take hundreds of people and throw them in jail, or is there a more subtle form of collaboration that is possible? However, if you look within the Trump administration, and I'm going to go back to that Treasury release from 5 days ago, when you're going after crude oil networks, that's when I begin to see, okay, there is more intelligence gathering going on here. That's how you choke off a cartel, right?
Yes.
When you choke off a cartel is death by 1,000 cuts. You can't destroy any cartel by even if you capture El Mencho, the CJNG will survive either as a unified force or as a splintered group, which is going to be even more dangerous and more violent.
Right.
You choke them off slowly by cutting off their ways of making money, right? Now it's a hydra. You cut off one head, two will reemerge. But that's the sort of process that I'm hoping to see more of from the administration.
Yeah, that's interesting. I agree. I think we're going to see a lot more intel gathering and slowly breaking down organizations just like that, just chipping away at them appropriately. You mentioned El Salvador. What are your thoughts on how El Salvador has kind of cleaned up their country?
My thoughts are not going to be particularly original on this one. I think I do not remove anything from the actual results. El Salvador went from one of the deadliest countries in the region, if not in the world, to one of the safest. Violent crime is down across the board. That's incredible. The thing is, it's led to two problems. One is internal, one is external. One is this internal perception of Bukele. Bukele is a dictator. I mean, yes, he won a fair election. I'm not denying that. But he has used this push to jail political opponents. Anyone who opposes him is threatened. Oh, well, we'll just say you're a gang member and you'll go into SECOT because, no one gets due process, right? You're getting dozens of people tried at a time. There's no due process. There's no follow-up. There's no what happens next. You could keep these people in that jail forever, but I guess that's impractical at a certain point. So what's the breaking point there? What's the end game 5-10 years down the line when you continue jailing people? You also haven't addressed the socioeconomic conditions that led to the gangs being a problem in the first place, right? You can't just systematically keep putting people in jail, but at some point that's going to lead to diminishing returns. And the trade-off for that is you have a dictator, you have police who have basically taken over extortion, corruption, and racketeering in the country. Yes, they're not killing people, which is, I'm not denying it, a huge plus. But it leads to this myth that that's the only way to go. And I've beaten my head against the screen talking to people in Ecuador, Argentina, even Chile, who are like, oh, well, we need to do the same thing. I'm like, you can't. You cannot do it. El Salvador is an incredibly dense, very populated country with gangs that were highly identifiable and with a level of violence that inured the population to the risks of this strategy. You cannot replicate it anywhere else. Like, I don't see a single country, maybe a Guatemala or Honduras, that could go down that same route as El Salvador with the same level of success. It's not possible. I hate that mano dura, which is Bukele's policy, has dominated the conversation so much because it diminishes the chance for other types of policymaking to get a look at.
Well, I thought it was interesting that the U.S. government, was entertaining that thought. I'm curious how you think about that real quick, because I want to get it after that. We're going to get into TDA, but I'm curious to know how you felt about, us putting these criminals who've been apprehended here in the United States and potentially sending them out there.
I mean, I want to push back on the notion that these people were all criminals. We have no idea. And again, I'm not completely alienated to this process of you enter the country illegally, you don't get the same due process as others. You get deported, you don't necessarily get a court case. Okay, that's legally dubious, but I can understand the rhetoric behind it. The thing is that these people didn't get due process, but they were not just deported back to their home countries. They were labeled as Tren de Aragua MS-13 terrorists with very little evidence, and then carted off to a maximum security prison in which they have essentially disappeared. It's a gulag. And again, I'm not asking your audience, I'm not asking Americans to be necessarily sympathetic with those people. It just, like in El Salvador, creates a worrying precedent, because who's next to be labeled a criminal and shipped off to some dark corner of the world that we don't hear about you anymore? I know it feels, liberal, wishy-washy for me to say it, but we know for a fact some of those people who were sent, those 250 odd, were not Tren de Aragua. Anyone who tells you that Tren de Aragua can be identified by a tattoo is wrong or lying. There is no Tren de Aragua tattoo. It's not MS-13 who tattooed it on their knuckles or their chests. Tren de Aragua, and I've been studying the buggers for 7 years, don't have identifying markers on their skin. You can identify them in other ways, social media, the criminal economies that they do. And that's one of the chapters of the book. One of the chapters of the book is, are Tren de Aragua terrorists? I would say yes, they are, in the threat that they pose. But you can't label them, you can't identify them in the way that we have been.
What is the title of the book that's coming out?
Tren de Aragua, the guide to America's growing criminal threat.
So let's talk about it. So I haven't heard almost nothing about TDA in the past probably 2 months now, because the conversation's been taken over. The MS-13 guy that was deported, and as well as, all the conversation about El Salvador and all the other little conversations, but TDA has almost been non-existent on my radar right now. Why is that?
The thing is, I don't think it's certainly less than it was when they carted off the 250. But if you Google, if you do a news alert on TDA, it'll pop up almost every day. They arrested, I think last week in Colorado, they busted Colorado Springs. They busted this illegal nightclub with about 100 people there, and they said it was Tren de Aragua. They said it was MS-13. My first instinct was, oh, it's bullshit. But then you look at the way Tren de Aragua spreads. It's discreet, it's quiet, and it's always in the same way in different countries. And illegal nightclubs are absolutely one of the ways they do it. So that caught my attention. I was like, okay,
was that the nightclub where military members were involved as well?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Now, there's no evidence that those guys were in any way aware of what was happening.
Correct.
Tren de Aragua very, very, very commonly sets up meetings in nightlife. They have DJs that they control, either in legitimate clubs that they take over to sell drugs or have sexual exploitation rings, but also as a meeting place. Their leaders often meet inside nightclubs because it's very obviously difficult to identify them. You can't really listen in, right? So that triggered my attention. You still see regularly Tren de Aragua guys being indicted. Most of it, for the first few months of the year, was like, these are not. There's very little here to say that Tren de Aragua. They were arrested, and then 2 hours later, the press release comes out. Tren de Aragua, remember? Like, well, how on earth are you proving that? But now they've indicted the crew from New York, and that again triggered a few of the red flags for Tren de Aragua, because I'm like, okay, this is embedded in the Venezuelan community. This is extortion. This is sex trafficking. This is pink cocaine, 2C, which is a Tren de Aragua hallmark. Again, you begin to see a few cases in the US which fit the pattern. I'm not saying it absolutely is Tren de Aragua, but it fits the pattern. That brings me to the main point of the book. The main point of the book is to tell the story of Tren de Aragua, which is unique in all of the drug trafficking gangs and criminal gangs that I've covered. They are the one that is the most unique in the way they operate. But it's also to show Tren de Aragua today is essentially three different things. One, you have the true Tren de Aragua members connected to the leadership in Venezuela and in Colombia. Two are the franchises. Tren de Aragua was always a criminal brand for hire. You and me could set up a gang if we were Venezuelan and say, oh, can we use the Tren de Aragua name? And as long as we're kicking money up to the right people, we can use the name with impunity, and we can decide what we do with it. But three, especially since 2023, you have copycats now. The name is so famous, the name is so potent that I was going to say originally any Venezuelan, but we've seen Peruvians, we've seen Chileans, we've seen Colombians use the name just to get attention. And then even more dangerous than that, perhaps, is the fact that law enforcement is not very aware of what Tren de Aragua is. And so any Venezuelan that's arrested, and I mean, illegal migrants often do commit crimes, we know that, is just throwing that label out of Tren de Aragua. I had one interview with a law enforcement officer in Montana, I won't name who it is, who told me off the record, yeah, we knew that it wasn't sure that the guy we arrested was Tren de Aragua, but it didn't hurt us to put the name out there because we got attention from federal officials, we got my name in the press. That's how you build your career, right? I'm like, yes, but it's a dangerous way to do it.
Yeah, that's not the righteous way of doing it. So let me ask, TDA, so what are some of the recruiting techniques you've seen for them to bring in a bigger gang? How are they growing so fast? How are they? And then on that same question, like, how are you identifying? You said the drugs, certain things. Like, I want to, for those who are listening, maybe they need more information on this. And so I would love to know, how are they recruiting and exactly how can you identify?
The main way that Tren de Aragua expanded was the Venezuelan political and economic crisis of the last decade, right? You have over 8 million Venezuelans who have exiled themselves, a lot of them close to home, so that's why the gang starts popping up in Colombia, then Peru, then Ecuador, then Chile. Then, as Venezuelans begin to move north, as the U.S. begins to be a more popular destination for Venezuelans, that's in the last 2 to 3 years, you see Tren de Aragua follow that movement. It always starts with that Venezuelan nucleus. Why? These people are desperately needy. They need to get across borders safely, and they need to trust the person who's getting them across that border. So other Venezuelan coyotes, Venezuelan people traffickers, are going to have an edge on getting those people across borders. The way they pay for it is, well, first of all, you pay for them for the privilege of getting across the border, but they're going to start criminalizing you. They're going to extort you. They're going to kidnap you and hold you for ransom if they think they have a chance of getting a payout. If you're a young woman or a girl, there's a likelihood that you're going to get a debt. And when you get to the city in the target country, you're going to be put into sexual exploitation, right? We see a case of this very prominent. It's probably the most emblematic Tren de Aragua case in the US to date is in Nashville, Tennessee. There's a sexual exploitation ring there that was moving a number of Venezuelan women between cities, including Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Those are the modus operandi that we see replicated time after time after time. There is a Tren de Aragua playbook that is not understood well enough. It's not the only way they expand, but kidnapping, extortion, sexual exploitation, and the setting up of criminal infrastructure within Venezuelan migrant populations is the Tren de Aragua playbook. And we see it in the US. There's not as many of them in the US as you might think. It's not thousands of people, setting up cells. But it is growing more subtly than we think. And even though you haven't spoken about it for the last 2 months, that's probably good news for them.
How much do you think the Venezuelan government plays into supporting and helping?
The Venezuelan government, I apologize, I'm just going to take a drink of water.
Yeah, please.
The Venezuelan government and their relationship to organized crime has to be understood. It's very unique as well. They provided support and room for Tren de Aragua and other Venezuelan gangs and Colombian gangs that operate in Venezuela to grow, because those gangs were a convenient source of both revenue, of control, and also as a way of removing political opposition. Tren de Aragua early on was supported by a governor called Tarek El Aissami, who went on to be vice president of Venezuela, now in prison, who essentially gave them carte blanche to thrive in Aragua and then to spread themselves across Venezuela. It's not that Maduro or the Venezuelan government has got a direct phone line to every member of Tren de Aragua can tell them what to do. But when they need them, they will absolutely use them for political needs. And while in Venezuela, wherever they operated, whatever racket they did, they had to kick money up the ladder to military, police, and government personnel. Do I believe the Maduro government is actively helping Tren de Aragua set itself up in the US? No. It's just a natural extension because now there's many, many Venezuelans moving to the US, legally or illegally, and that's fertile ground for Tren de Aragua.
Man, it's interesting. Has there been any proof of TDA moving into other countries, Canada maybe, and facilitating the same way?
That is the number one question I get in the last 2 weeks is Tren de Aragua in Canada? I'm going to be in November at a conference there, the National Gang Investigators Association, to discuss that. Not as of yet. I haven't seen anything in Canada as of yet, but there is significant pressure, and we know that Venezuelans are moving in greater numbers to Canada. Now, I want to caution, I am not in any way saying that Venezuelan migrant populations are the cause of the spread of Tren de Aragua. Most of them are hardworking people who are trying to make a better life for themselves within possibility, and sometimes make difficult choices in terms of legal or illegal migration. But as the Trump administration has been deporting significant numbers of Venezuelans, as it's made it much more difficult to enter the country both legally and illegally, Canada is next, right? We know of Venezuelan migrants who have expatriated themselves from the US to Canada, and asylum requests in Canada are up. Tren de Aragua has recognized the threat. It has labeled Tren de Aragua a terrorist organization as well, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police has signed an agreement with Interpol to share information on Tren de Aragua. So Canada's getting ready for that potential threat. I haven't seen any evidence of them there as of yet.
Interesting. Yeah, the Canada market is starting to pick up a lot. What we're hearing and what we're seeing, we have another associate of ours who gives us a lot of information from Canada, and it sounds like the cartel side of things is really connection. So it only makes sense that TDA would find a way of making money and extortion, everything in Canada as well.
The thing is that I don't know of any criminal group in Canada that does what TDA does. So it's essentially, Canada is such a United Nations of crime. I don't know if you saw the recent case that is the FBI's most wanted guy right now is Canadian, Ryan Wedding, Canadian narco living in Mexico at the moment. They put a $10 million bounty on his head, which is extremely rare. And I did a feature on him a few months ago. I mean, he's connected to the Hells Angels, Iranian money launderers, Colombian cocaine manufacturers, the Sinaloa and the CJNG cartels. In fact, he brokered a deal between them. And then Punjabi Sikh criminals in Toronto. So this guy, wow, Canadian guy, brokered one of the most diverse criminal networks I've ever seen. But there was no extortion. There was no kidnapping. It wasn't his modus operandi. So there's no one in Canada doing that sort of crime that I know of, at least on a large scale. So I think Tren de Aragua would find it a normal extension of their work to get to Canada at some point.
Is there any other countries that TDA has been identified in?
So going back to Latin America, the main bases have been Venezuela, Colombia, and Chile. And Chile is a really interesting and relevant case study for the US and Canada. Why? Of course, Chile is not comparable to the US in terms of income, in terms of GDP, in terms of average wealth, or in terms of law enforcement. But for South America, Chile was the good student, right? It has a stable democracy. It has very low, comparable to Europe, murder rates, very low penetration of organized crime, of course, more than the US, but still. And yet, Tren de Aragua went through Chile like a knife through butter. They had it took a couple of years for the Chileans, and they reacted spectacularly well. But it took them a couple of years to identify how bad Tren de Aragua had got in the country. Venezuelan migrants turning up dead on the border, exploited, bringing in drugs, sexual exploitation rings, prostitution rings across Chile. Then Tren de Aragua using that to take over existing Chilean organized crime very quickly. And then by the time Chilean police sort of woke up, it was 2 years in, and you had 36 murders. So that's a country that was relatively safe, and Tren de Aragua managed to get in very quickly. Since then, there's been some changes. In 2023, and this is a hugely important moment, the Venezuelan government finally takes out Tocoron prison. Tocoron prison is Tren de Aragua's base in Venezuela. It's essentially their palace. They had a zoo, a nightclub, a children's park, house. It wasn't a prison. They could leave and come as they went. It was their fortress. Every prisoner was paying into like this $1 million money-making machine. They had shops selling every drug you imagine. You had famous artists, reggaeton artists performing there. Finally, in 2023, Venezuela busts up that prison. They send in 11,000 soldiers, just to give you an idea of the operation. And that sort of splinters Tren de Aragua's command and control center. So that's what leads now to this 3 tiers of Tren de Aragua. You have the core members, the franchises, and the copycats. And they're all using the name, and they're all operating more or less in the same space. But you have to distinguish between them to lead a good operation.
It's interesting. Is there, their model of how they did it is very new. We haven't seen anything like this. Or am I wrong? Is there other organizations that are starting to kind of grow and exploit just like TDA did? Because the cartel didn't do it that way, right? This seems to be very, very nuanced to the TDA. Am I correct?
I don't know of anybody doing it the way the TDA did, and I don't know that it's possible, because it was not only, they thought of a cool economic model and then they did it. It was also they surfed on the wave of those millions of Venezuelans going around the region, right? You suddenly had a massively vulnerable, quite wealthy population. Remember, Venezuela was, until a couple of decades ago, among the wealthiest countries in Latin America. So you had a moneyed population moving and needing help and having the money to a certain extent to pay for it. That rapidly led the Tren de Aragua to be very wealthy, to recruit people and to recruit them well, because they were offering, Venezuelan criminal jobs, so to speak. It was like a home brand. And they gave a lot of flexibility to their members. And they also wisely stayed out of the big rackets. They didn't do large-scale cocaine trafficking or fentanyl. That wasn't their deal. That's why kidnapping, extortion, sexual exploitation was their bread and butter, because it was an uncontested space.
Interesting.
So no, I don't think we'll see anybody doing it the same way anytime soon.
It's fascinating, man, and I appreciate you bringing all your expertise. Tell me more about your book and when that comes out.
So it comes out on May 22nd, 2025. If you'd be so kind, I'll give you a link if anybody wants to sign up for a review copy. We're doling them out like candy at the moment. It's the first complete book to the history of Tren de Aragua ever, in English or Spanish. It's coming out in both languages. And in 18 thematic chapters, we walk people through everything. We walk people through how it started, like literally the villages where it started. We walk through who the leadership is, how they became these transcontinental kingpins when they were just murderers for hire in one part of Venezuela. We look at the criminal governance of Tren de Aragua, which is again really unique. The way complete communities were subverted to their will. Everybody has to pay extortion, but at the same time, it's Tren de Aragua keeping the lights on. And then we follow them country by country. We follow them into Colombia, into Chile, into Peru. And then we move into the U.S. And in the U.S., I go state by state. Not all 50, but every state that's had a reported Tren de Aragua problem, I analyze it, I break down the cases, and I look, okay, this is unlikely to be Tren de Aragua, this absolutely was, and this likely was. And that, I think, gives readers, whether they're a general audience who's heard the name, or law enforcement, prosecutors actually fighting Tren de Aragua cases, it gives them an operational overview that I think has been lacking.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, I'm excited to get it myself and get my hands on it. Is there anything else that we missed in the interview that you'd like to give to the audience?
No, you know what? I will say World of Crime now is moving more and more into a consulting space. After the CJNG book that we did last year, we got a lot of sort of interest from law enforcement, from governments in the US, in Canada, in Europe. And so that's something that we're looking to explore more and more, which is, I think we have developed quite a nice niche of taking the latest criminal developments and reducing the time gap between criminal development and legal or law enforcement reaction. We're always one or two steps behind, and perhaps you always will be. But I think what Wolfram can do is take those latest developments and turn that into fairly quick policy recommendations. And that's proven useful.
Awesome. Well, Chris, I appreciate you, man. Honestly, thank you so much for your time. And I'm excited to get my hands on your book.
You'll have it tomorrow.
Awesome.
My pleasure, Vince. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Borderland Narcosis, an Ironclad original presented by First Form. Check out your First Form supplements at firstform.com/Borderland. Like I said before, the protein bars are great. The meat sticks, they're probably even better. Take care.